Halito, and welcome to Native ChocTalk, a podcast by natives for all. Here, we're keeping our Native ancestors' stories and history alive while also sharing with you our Native cultures, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And stay tuned for the end of each episode where we'll talk about some great ways to support Native causes and or Native-owned businesses. Let's get started.
Potential is everywhere in the Choctaw people. It's in our schools and students. It's in our small businesses and entrepreneurs. Potential is in our lifestyle and health. It's in our culture and heritage. Passion and commitment is in our blood. Ingenuity and economy are a tradition. And the Choctaw Foundation was founded for this potential. To cultivate minds and hearts, to stimulate ideas and passions, to extend lives and improve health through education, and to preserve and promote the power of our past. The Choctaw Foundation, meeting the potential of the Choctaw people.
There once was a general named George Crook, bless his heart, who in March of 1886 forced Geronimo into surrender, but Geronimo escaped that as well, right?
Yeah, he really didn't force him into surrender, although I think that's a matter of interpretation. But Geronimo agreed to meet with Crook to discuss terms of surrender at Canyon de Emudos, which is about 12 miles south of a slaughter ranch in the eastern corner, southeastern corner of Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
But they had he and the rest of the major leaders had a long talk with Crook. Crook told them they should do what they wanted to do, but if they didn't surrender, then he would kill every one of them, and if it took him 50 years of chasing them, and they believed him. And so a day or two later, actually 2 days later, they agreed to surrender. There was a whiskey peddler who had set up a tent just within walking distance of where Crook and the Apaches were meeting. And after the Apaches decided that they were going to surrender, they decided they needed a drink. And so Geronimo went over to get one, and a whiskey peddler that he had known for a long time and had done business with, trading everything from livestock to firearms, wound up telling him that the plan was for them to get Geronimo across the border, and then Crook was going to turn him over to the civilian authorities, which was not true. But that's what the president, Grover Cleveland, wanted to do. And so after a couple of nights of drinking in a heavily way, Geronimo and about 40 of his people, there were, I think, 18 men and 22 women and children, escaped in the middle of the night when they were about 3 miles from the border, and they headed for Fronteras. And the soldiers with the scouts tried to catch them, but by the time they got to Frontiers, they did an old Apache trick, which was everybody take off in a different direction, and they couldn't follow all of them, and they were about out of supplies anyway, and so they turned around, and so Geronimo escaped that as well.
Wow, another escape.
Yeah.
Why don't you share about Geronimo and his run-ins with General Miles, bless his heart too?
Well, if you include the surrender in 1886, Miles was afraid to go accept the surrender of Geronimo and Naiche in Skeleton Canyon. They were supposed to, the Apaches came up with Lawton escorting them to prevent attacks from Mexicans and U.S. cavalry to Skeleton Canyon there in the southeastern corner of Arizona. And they actually got there about the 1st of September. And Miles was afraid to go accept the surrender of Geronimo and Naiche, because Geronimo had told Crook that he was going to surrender and then didn't, and Crook had to resign his job there. And so Lawton had to beg and cajole Miles to come down and accept the surrender. And Miles, in his telegrams, hinted in his answers to Lawton's telegrams that if Geronimo and his people were killed escaping, he wouldn't mind. And in fact, he also emphasized that about 3 times before he finally sucked it up and came down. And 3 days later, 1886, September the 4th, was when the surrender was formally took place. There's also the debate at the 1898 Omaha's World's Fair Exposition, where Geronimo went to his first World's Fair exposition so people could see him. And lo and behold, Miles, who is now the Secretary of the Army, came, and they actually had a debate where Geronimo flat out said Miles had lied to him about the surrender, and Miles laughed at him and said, yeah, that's right, I lied to you once, you lied to everybody your entire life, and I learned from you. But what it appeared to the newspaper reporters who were there was in fact that Geronimo had gotten a good lick in and showed what an ass Miles was.
There you go. And Miles is over there pulling his hair out.
Yeah.
Wow. You talked about the Trojan horse earlier. Let's talk about that in a little more depth and the reservation the U.S. government created for the Chiricahua Apache in 1872.
Okay. The Trojan horse in the story in Homer was a lie. The Greeks set it up so that the Trojans believed that they were leaving, and the Trojan horse was a gift to the gods that the Trojans could have, and so they pulled it inside their gates. Well, Miles used lies when he got Geronimo to surrender. and so he had promised first that if they surrendered, then the men would get to see their families in 5 days. Well, that didn't happen. It was more like 7 months.
Oh my
gosh. They were deliberately separated because of it. And secondly, that they would have a reservation where they could farm and ranch, and on and on it went. The reservation that the government created for Cochise was called the Chiricahua Reservation, although it was only for the Choconans in 1872, and they basically gave Cochise everything that he wanted. On the other hand, when they started looking at a reservation for the Chiricahuas after 1886, it took them 27 years before they finally came up with a solution. Some of the Chiricahuas stayed there at Fort Sill, and some, the majority, about 2/3, went to the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico.
Wow. And you talked earlier about the news and the papers and what they would say. He was really big news throughout the U.S. too, with all these goings on, wasn't he?
Yeah, and in fact, he knew it. I have yet to figure out exactly how that worked, but one of the things that he told Miles when he surrendered was, "I want my record wiped clean, and I don't want the newspapers to be writing about hanging me or my men."
Really?
Yeah.
So interesting. So somebody was, I don't know if he could he read English?
He couldn't read.
Wow. So someone was telling him.
Yeah. He had in late, well, not late, about halfway through his captivity, he had become a member of the Army, believe it or not, and he had a watch, and he couldn't read the numbers, but he knew that a circle around the watch corresponded to what the Apaches call a hand of time, which if you hold the flat of your hand up against the horizon and start counting and go from top to bottom, you'll find that it's right at 12 hours or 12 hands. And so for an Apache, an hour's time was about a hand width of the sun moving against the horizon.
Oh, wow. Interesting little tidbit there.
Yeah.
Wow. So with all these battles that were going on, was he wounded along the way?
Yeah. There was a famous portrait artist, a man named Elbridge Eyre Burbank, who painted Geronimo several times at Fort Sill for the Chicago Field Museum. And he became good friends with Geronimo. And one day Geronimo showed him his body. And Burbank said that he counted more than 50 scars on Geronimo's body. Some were deep enough to even hold a pebble.
Whoa. Well, you know how earlier you said that it was kind of frowned upon if you got wounded in battle, but I think he deserved it, don't you? I mean, he worked really hard.
Yeah, he did.
Well, one more question about, Geronimo, all these battles. I would think that the fact that he knew the land there so well was really helpful in his running from the soldiers along the way, right?
Oh yeah, it made a big difference. I mean, the fact that the Apaches knew where every water hole was. They knew that they could hide in arroyos. They knew how to cross the border where they wouldn't be seen. Made all the difference. In the fact that they were such phenomenal athletes, you could easily estimate that one Apache was the equivalent to maybe 10 Army privates, or maybe more than that. It just depended on the situation.
Yeah. Well, without further ado, would you read to us some words from the book, again titled "The Iliad of Geronimo"?
Sure. I'll read a little about his first escape from San Carlos in 1878, and the setup for the scene I'm going to read is they had decided to have a big tulapai drunk.
Okay.
The army had given the women their ration of corn to plant, and they decided they had a lot more than they needed, and so they made tulapai, which is like a strong beer made from corn. Sometimes it's weak, sometimes it's strong, but when the beer was ready, they had a big get together, and Geronimo drank it down, and he was tearing his hair trying to figure out, since they couldn't on a reservation, they couldn't take the young men out with the warriors to do their 4-time raid drill, and so how in the world would they ever know that a kid was a man? And he kind of made some bad mistakes that night, and eventually passed out. And this is where the reading picks up. The sound of women wailing filled my dream. I wondered for whom they cried, but their cries didn't vanish when I cracked an eye open to the bright sunlight and felt the throbbing in my head like someone keeping time on a stiff hide with a looped willow stick. Someone had covered me with a blanket, which I pushed off as I staggered up, drank a long time from the water jug left for me, and then splashed cold water on my face. It was 3 or 4 hours after the sun had come, bright and throwing shafts of light through the tops of the pines. I saw the people of the camp gathered at the farthermost wickiup set back in the trees. I stared at the place. Through the thick fog in my brain, the realization came slowly that they stood around Nadoste's lodge. I ran, staggering and stumbling, thinking that my sister had ridden the ghost pony to the happy place. The crowd parted to let me into the inner circle. Nadoste was on her knees, keening beside a blanket on which the body of my nephew lay. An angry, raw rope burn was around his neck. He had made himself dance on the air and ridden the ghost pony to the happy place. I shook my head in disbelief. Why would a young man near the prime of his life kill himself? I turned to the group around us. Why did he do this? Why? Chapo spoke up and said, after he spoke with you, Father, he walked past us into the darkness saying over and over, I will be a man. I will be a man. Nadoste stopped her crying and said, what did you say to him, brother? I was thinking of what we should do now that boys cannot go on raids as novitiates, in order that they be recognized as warriors and men. I asked him how he thought he might prove himself a man if he couldn't be a Novier. He said he would be a man, and I said, Inju, good. Now Doste buried her face in her hands and wailed. I said, come, sister. I will help you with the burial ceremonies for Yeshaye, your son, and my Shika, my nephew. He was a good boy. Usan will hurry his journey to the happy place. This is the White Eyes' fault, I thought. They won't let our sons become men. But as I thought of the last time I spoke with my nephew, I realized it was my fault. My nephew had thought that I had said I could never be a man and had killed himself to prove he was a man. It was time to leave this place where no good comes to those who stay under the watch of the bluecoats and white eyes, and they would blame me for the tulip I drink.
So listeners, it's the Iliad of Geronimo by W. Michael Farmer. Go get you a copy today. There's so much more in that book that we can all uncover about Geronimo. I love this. Thank you, Michael, for that. And we'll actually come back to what happened in Geronimo's world in just a bit. I want to talk about also your newest book coming out in November of 2022, which I'm excited, listeners, because I got a little sneak peek at it. The name of the book is Trinidad, Geronimo's Captivity of Trinidad Verdun. Listeners, I twisted Michael's arm to give us all a little more of a sneak peek into the content, and it is extremely interesting. Tell us about Trini and about her encounter with Geronimo.
Trini was a 12-year-old girl when all of this happened. She was an orphan, and she was living on a ranch with an aunt whose name was Petra Peck. She was married. Petra was married to a man named Artisan who had got some money together, and they had bought a little ranch and were trying to develop it into something. They already had a 2-year-old son named Andy, and Petra was unexpectedly pregnant again, and so she had asked Trinidad to come help her with the chores as her pregnancy progressed, and she was there. And one morning, while she was trying to get the baby to go to sleep, they heard the horses and other livestock in the corral stomping around nervously, and she asked Trinidad to go look. And Trinidad peeked through a crack and saw an Apache squatting in the dust, eyeballing the stock. She ran back, told her aunt. Her aunt took a revolver that her husband had left. He had gone off with a neighbor he had hired to help him mark some wild bulls that they had caught. And long story short, the Apache killed her with one shot and snatched up the baby and smashed its head against the side of the building and killed it. Her aunt had told Trinidad to hide and not let him see her, and she got under the bed. Shortly after her aunt was murdered, about 15 other Apaches showed up, and they tore the place apart. And in doing so, they discovered Trinidad and pulled her out from under the bed and was about to cut her throat when Geronimo walked in and told him to wait. And I think while this is pretty much a true story, I think the reason that he wanted to save her was to keep her as an exchange captive for their people that the Mexicans had put into slavery. In any case, they took Trinidad with them, went out, and they found her uncle and the hired man doing their work. They tried to get away. They killed the hired man, killed the horse that her uncle Artisan was on, and he thought he was going to die. Trinidad was riding behind the son of Geronimo, and they carried Artisan up to Geronimo. Introductions were made. Geronimo thought it was kind of funny that the guy was wearing these long sleeve, long underwear, and they called him Mangus Coloradus, red sleeves. And told him that Geronimo had lost all of his family too. And so he let him go, but he told him not to go back to his ranch. And the warriors threw him on the ground, took off all his clothes except his long underwear, took his boots. And the last time Trinidad saw him for a while, he was walking across a hot desert in his bare feet and red underwear. And eventually he made it back to a little town that they were close to, and about 10 miles north of Nogales, named Calabasas. And in the meantime, Trinidad wound up living with the Apaches for about 2 months. And just about everything that we know about what Geronimo did during those 2 months comes from her stories. And she wound up being well liked by the Apaches because first she did what they told her to do, and she was pretty energetic in helping Geronimo's wife with the chores and gathering firewood and stuff like that. She became friends with a 10-year-old boy who taught her how to use a sling, and she taught him how to speak Spanish. And eventually managed to get away when Mexican paramilitary ran upon her with Geronimo and a few other of the Apaches, not the whole group. There was a big shootout. Geronimo yelled for her to get up on the back of his horse, and he was riding away when the horse stumbled and threw both of them. And she suddenly realized that this was probably her only chance to get away from the Apaches, and so she ran for the Mexicans who were shooting, taking a risk that they thought or they would think that she was an Apache. And fortunately, they didn't shoot her, and she made it back to Nogales, and never saw the Apaches again.
Wow. I was telling you earlier that there's that part that you described where Trini could see her aunt being killed, and it's just so heart-wrenching and terrifying. And at the same time, there's two sides to every story. There's a reason that the Apaches were these fierce warriors, and it's just kind of an interesting dynamic between Trini and the idea of Geronimo and being on that ride with him for 2 months, or being around them for 2 months. Yeah. This story is so interesting, y'all, and I would probably bet my next paycheck our listeners have not heard about this story. So let's hear an excerpt from this book again, called Trini Come, Geronimo's Captivity, of Trinity Verdun?
Well, there's the setup is in this excerpt is she's with her Apache friend, a boy named Garditha, who'd been teaching her how to use a sling while she taught him to speak Spanish. They finished their camp chores after the band had moved to the Santa Cruz River and had been given permission to go practice with their slings. And this is where the story picks up. We soon tired of skipping rocks and following the curve in the river south until we came to a high bank with a wide bench to the river on its east side. The bank in deep shadows was an ideal place for us to set up cross-stick targets for our slings. The sun moved about a hand while we practiced. I was happy my stones were hitting closer to my cross-sticks target than in earlier practices, and I was throwing harder. Garditha was throwing with such speed and accuracy that he destroyed his target and had to replace his target sticks twice. I was waiting for him to replace his target a third time when I heard a horse snort upstream, and looking over my shoulder saw 3 vaqueros with amused looks on their faces, mounted on horses standing in the middle of the river, a little upstream from us. The oldest, his face covered by a gray, scraggly beard and a sombrero hanging against his back, had a cigarette dangling from the crooked smile on his lips. The other 2, a couple of steps behind him, seemed to be waiting for him to take the lead. The one to his left looked the youngest, and didn't have any hair growing on his face. The one to his right looked about artisan's age and moved as if there was little doubt what he would do next. They all wore holsters filled with big revolvers and full cartridge belts. I had no idea how long they had been there, and didn't think Garditha, working on his target against the bank, had seen them either or could see them now. I felt a surge of hope, perhaps today freedom. But as I looked at the old one's narrowed eyes, his long, greasy, salt and peppered hair hanging close to his brow and sneer on his lips, I heard warning bells ringing in the back of my mind. I didn't like the looks of the man, whom the others seemed to follow and who might save me. He took a draw on his cigarette, blew the smoke up toward the trees, and said in Spanish, "So, muchacho, how is it you play with an Apache? Where is his padre? Maybe he's stolen you from your padre, eh? Apache hair, even from a muchacho, sells for good money in Nogales." He flipped his cigarette in the river and held a finger to his lips for silence before he motioned toward the young man on his left and pointed toward me. Young one grinned and rode across the river toward me. I had frozen, uncertain what to do, until the old one spoke of Apache hair selling in Nogales. He was going to kill and scalp my friend Garditha, take his hair for money. I felt sick just thinking about it. The Apaches were no more brutal in killing Petra and Andy than the vaqueros would be in killing and scalping an Apache child, not to mention what they might do to me because my family wasn't rich enough to pay a ransom for me. As young one approached the riverbank, I shook my head and pointed for them to go away. Old one, grinning like a hungry wolf, again held his finger to his lips and drew a skinning knife from a sheath on his gun belt. He nodded to the man on his right, who drew his knife too. What they planned to do, I could not let happen. I had left a nice, smooth pebble in the pouch of my sling while I waited for Garditha to fix his target, and I started to whirl it as I took a step back. Young one's horse was nearly to the riverbank when I heard a smacking sound like a fist hitting a palm. Garditha's throw, straight and true, hit the young one in the right temple above his eye. Young one's arms flew up as his head snapped back. A look of surprise frozen on his face. his eyes wide and losing life. His reins slid from his fingers and he rolled slowly off his horse to land face down in the river. Garditha screamed his war cry just as I threw as hard as I could to hit the old one. My stone struck his arm near where he was holding his skinning knife. He dropped the knife and bellowed, "Ow, maldita puta," damned whore. I was very lucky to hit him at all. I had been aiming for his head. He dropped his reins and reflexively tried to reach his revolver while holding his wrist, but he couldn't make his hand close on it and lift it. There was a big knot on his arm near his wrist where my stone had hit. I knew then that the stone must have broken a bone. While the old one tried to pull his revolver, I loaded another stone and started to whirl it when a stone from Garditha whizzed past the third vaquero's face and took off most of his ear, just as he threw his knife, which thudded into a tree a hand width from Garditha's head. The vaquero's hand flew to cover his bleeding ear. A grinning snarl filled his face, which was wrinkled in pain. He laughed and reached for his pistol and had it halfway out of his holster, but then glanced to where the riverbed's curve blocked his view of our camp and slammed it back in its holster. Oldland's horse spooked and pranced around, raising sprays of water with each hoof as it tried to decide which way to run. The blood-ear vaquero managed to gather its reins and jerked it to attention, saying quietly, "Whoa, whoa, muchacho. Jose, stick your arm in your shirt for a sling. We ride." He glanced at the young vaquero still face down in the water, then me, and snarled, "Soon, puta hova vincita. Whore, young and small, we come back and kill you all." A sling's throw whizzed past his horse's rump, leaving a streak of bright red and making it squeal and rear, nearly throwing him off. He yelled at the old man, "Grab your saddle and hold on." He put spurs to his horse and, leading the old man's horse, charged straight for me. I waited until they were nearly upon me, so close I could see the blood from his ear trickling down the collar of his shirt, to jump out of the way as they thundered past. They spurred their horses unmercifully, their hooves leaving a dust cloud behind them as they raced up the river towards San Lazaro. Garditha ran past me, pointing toward the young vaquero's horse, signaling for me to grab its reins. I waded into the river, holding my hand out and clicking to him, and he stood long enough for me to snatch the reins. He didn't try to run, but I held on to them as if they were a lifeline. When Garditha stopped splashing in his run to the vaquero, I turned to see him jump and land on the man's shoulders with his knees, his knife out, and it seemed in one motion. He grabbed his black, greasy hair, pulled his face out of the water, and made a clean, fast slice across his throat before dropping his head to make the water around the vaquero's body slowly turn red. I felt sick and wanted to puke, but I swallowed it back. Garditha, who told me later he had never killed a man, was pale and looked sick too. We stared at each other for a moment before I led the horse out of the water and tied it in the brush, out of sight from the river. Garditha and I tugged Young's body out of the red water and onto the bank. We each took an arm and struggled to drag it into the brush where it would be hard to see. I told Garditha to stay nearby while I ran to get Geronimo. He nodded, waved for me to go on, and ran to a towering cottonwood with big roots, where he could slump between them and become practically invisible to anyone near the river's edge. I ran down the river to Shiga's fire, where she still worked on her evening meal. I ran up to her out of breath. "Geronimo, you run hard, mujercita." She cocked her head to one side. "Why Geronimo?" I puffed out of breath. "Because Garditha and I have killed a vaquero and driven off 2 others towards San Lazaro. They yelled they were coming back to kill us." Shiga's jaw dropped, and then she was up and running over to the willow tree where Geronimo napped. When she pulled back the limbs where he snored, He was already up on his knees with his rifle cocked and ready to bring it to his shoulder. His eyes glittering with excitement, he said, "What's happened, woman?"
We talked about poor General Miles earlier. Is that who he surrendered to?
It is. Yeah.
Wow. You once told me that your favorite book you've written is The Odyssey of Geronimo, 23 Years a Prisoner of War. Why is that your favorite?
Because I think it shows the strength, the courage, and the heart of a man under hard times, and how, given his advanced age, he managed to survive
Well
and do it
said.
very well. Yeah.
Well said. Once I'm finished with the 3 books you sent me, by the way, listeners, Michael was kind enough to send me 3 books while I was recovering from a surgery, and I've been so grateful to have those books. So once I've finished all 3, I'm interested to see which one will be my favorite, and if I agree with you. So, but I love that you took Geronimo's story and turned it into a first person's perspective. It brings him to life a bit. What's the time frame that this book covers?
It runs from 1886 to February 1909.
Okay. So why don't you read to us a bit out of this book again? It really, like I said, it makes him come to life. So The Odyssey of Geronimo, 23 Years a Prisoner of War.
Okay. Fort Pickens and Pensacola Bay, where only the men with Geronimo had stayed for 7 months and heard nothing from their families.
Mm.
Now the Army has been under such heat for the way they treated the Apaches at Fort Marion and St. Augustine, that they are carrying them to Mount Vernon Barracks, 30 miles north of Mobile. And the families of the Geronimo men are dropped off on the way, and the men have spent the day watching for them from the top of Fort Pickens. And this is where the story picks up. The sun was falling into the big water to the west and painting the sky in oranges and purples. But we looked to the east, where there was a little plume of smoke on the water. The plume grew and came toward us. We climbed down from the top of the fort and started a fire so our women and children might see us and have its warmth when the soldiers brought them down the trail through the sweet smell of the flowers in the trees and vines and the welcome songs of insects and peepers. We lighted the lanterns Langdon gave us and carried them to light the rooms we would have. When we waited by the fire for our families to come to us, there was only a fingernail moon, and it was dark, and it was a very dark evening. We waited, staring into the darkness, listening for them to come. It seemed like we waited a long time, and then, as if by some magical silent ceremony, their faces showed at the edge of the firelight. Children ran to their fathers, who swooped them up and held them close. Our women came forward, proud and full of grace. Shiga came hurrying out of the darkness, followed by Zaye, holding Fenton's hand, and then Itata came into the light with our daughter in her arms. I took Fenton in my arms and swung him out in a wide circle while he giggled, his eyes shining. My women came to stand around me, and I looked each of them in the eye before I spoke. I said, "My women and children have come. Turn yourselves and let my happy eyes see you." They turned. Shiga looked thinner than I expected. Maybe she needed medicine. I would speak to her of this when we were alone. Perhaps I could make her some medicine and do a sing to help her. Shiga laughed and said, "Husband, your women and children have returned. Our hearts are warmed to see you." Zaye, her eyes sparkling in the firelight, said, "Husband, it has been 2 harvests since the White Eyes took me and your son Fenton. Usen has returned us to you. He has answered our prayers. Tata came forward with a bright smile, laid our baby in my arms, and said, "Husband, I bring you our first child, a daughter. I ask that we name her Lena." Lena was a fine baby. She was asleep when Tata gave her to me and stirred enough to chew her fist as I rocked her in my arms. I said, "I don't know where you found this name, but I'm happy with it. She is Lena, daughter of the Chiricahua Apache Goyakala, the Diane, the Naikis call Geronimo." Shiga saw me glancing over the other children for Shistashay's child. I didn't see her. And when I glanced at Shiga, she looked at the ground and shook her head. I saw my warriors talking calmly with their wives and children, not publicly showing their great affection for them with bad manners, as the White Eyes did. And I was proud of them all. I reached down, took Fenton by the hand, and said, "Come, my son, I show you where you live here on the big water."
Beautiful. I love this. Okay, maybe I'll like this book better than Trinity. I don't know. That was beautiful. Goosebumps moments. Wow. And then Geronimo, he there was a side of him that you just pointed out, where he was a father. And then on the other side, he was a warrior. And he obviously felt great passion for his family, his first family that he had to go vindicate. And then he had more children later. And obviously this, you have to see that side of Geronimo too, that surely he was a father that loved his children. And then he was a prisoner of the US for how many more years?
For the rest of his life, or for about 23 years.
Wow. Well, why did he surrender?
He actually wanted to die like Victorio did. Victorio was nearly out of ammunition when he was fighting the Mexicans. And when he had fired his last bullet, he pulled out his knife and stabbed himself in the heart. That's how Geronimo wanted to go. But he surrendered because three of his best warriors, Yanoza, Fun, and Perico, said they would surrender because they wanted to see their families. And Geronimo said that without them, there was just no chance of the band's survival.
Wow. Yeah. It was that weird place to be as any kind of warrior, leader, chief, whatever it was at the time, to have to make a decision about what's best for themselves, their families, their tribe, and the survival of all of them later. So another book you wrote, Geronimo, Prisoner of Lies, is set around the time frame of Geronimo after his surrender in 1886. And this goes back a bit to General Miles and that whole Trojan horse thing. So what did happen in the late 19th and early 20th centuries after Geronimo's surrender?
The terms of the Geronimo Naiche band, and I include Naiche there because he was the chief. The terms of their surrender were not met. First, they were supposed to be reunited with their family in 5 days. It took over a year. Two, they implied they would not be POWs more than 2 years. And they were POWs for 27 years.
Oh, wow.
Three, they were promised a big reservation with no other tribes on it. And they very nearly had it at Fort Sill, but it never happened. Nevertheless, at Fort Sill, they had their own horses. They learned farming and carpenter skills, had the best cattle herd in the state, and each family had 10 acres to raise garden vegetables, grain, and cotton crops. The Chiricahuas preserved some modicum of their culture. You see this when their children who were taken to Carlisle School in Pennsylvania for years. Some of them were gone as long as 8 years, returned to their families when they were free to go. And when they got out of Carlisle, they were not considered prisoners of war anymore, but they went back and they stayed with their families anyway.
Oh, okay.
Geronimo appeared in 3 World Fair expositions. He rode in Teddy Roosevelt's inaugural parade, married 2 women, had 2 children, was a village chief and a justice of the peace, and was wealthy when he died. Many of the Chiricahuas became Christians, including Geronimo, for about 3 years. And most of the Chiricahua men joined the U.S. Army as full-fledged soldiers. And when their terms were up, they were free to go, but their families were not.
Interesting. So then after the surrender, were the Apache able to maintain their tribal culture?
Yeah, they did. And, you know, as I say, there was enough training there, even when the children were quite small, that they still came back. And the Chiricahuas did things like they would tell them stories over and over until the point where the children could repeat the story from memory. And they had feasts and special days, and you know, it was just something that, and the Chiricahua men knew exactly what they were doing. They knew if they didn't do something like that, then their culture would disappear. And that's what the whites wanted.
Interesting. Well, of course, yeah, that makes sense. Well, I'm amazed that they were able to hang on to their culture as long as they did. And now, of course, today we're all trying to relearn that culture. So let's hear from your book, Geronimo, Prisoner of Lies.
Okay, this is what life was like for the Chiricahuas at Fort Marion in St. Augustine. The first group sent to Fort Marion was shipped from Bowie Station, about 11 miles north of Fort Bowie. There were 77 prisoners, 15 men, 33 women, and 29 children. Among these were 2 wives and 3 children of Geronimo, 2 wives, 2 children, and the mother of Naiche. They reached Fort Marion on April 13th, one day after General Miles relieved General Crook due to his resignation, when Geronimo failed to come in as he had agreed. Later that year, the War Department asked Fort Marion's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Loomis L. Langdon, later to be commander of Fort Pickens, if he could take 400 or 500 more prisoners. Langdon answered he could take at most another 75, but he recommended not sending any more at all. He explained in a revealing letter the kinds of conditions under which his prisoners lived. Walls with casemates, once inhabited by the garrison, surrounded the small 100-foot square parade ground. However, the terraplane above the casemates had become so dilapidated and leaked so badly that the casemates were uninhabitable. Langdon wrote that he had put up 18 tents on the terraplane, which was 15 yards wide with 4-foot-high walls around the edges, to shelter the first group of prisoners, and could possibly put up 20 more tents there to house 80 more. But he said sanitary conditions would be bad. There were only 2 bathtubs, one for men and one for women in the entire fort. The fort was so close to and surrounded by St. Augustine that it was impractical to put tents outside the walls or on some nearby islands which overflowed with water in the winter. Nevertheless, General Philip Sheridan passed Langdon's letter to the rest of the Army command with a written comment. The conditions stated by Colonel Langdon need not interfere with sending the remainder of the Chiricahua and Warm Springs Indians to Fort Marion. By remainder, Sheridan meant the nearly 400 people, peaceable Apaches then living quietly at Fort Apache. By the end of August, 3 of the young Apache children had died. One was the 4-year-old daughter of Geronimo, who had been feeble when she arrived. Langdon and the post surgeon had tried to improve her health with milk and other good food to no avail. Langdon allowed the Apaches to go into town in small groups under escort to make purchases in the stores, often for food, which was in short supply of bureaucratic edict. The women did a good business in beadwork, and the men in bows and arrows.
Very good. That makes me want to read that too, just because of the Fort Sill factor. I have ties to Fort Sill as well that you'll hear in just a moment, but very good. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Sure.
So once Geronimo and his tribe surrenders, they're sent by train to Florida to Fort Pickens, then to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, and then to Fort Sill in Lawton, Oklahoma, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so now, we can't talk about the time after Geronimo's surrender without talking about the National Historic Landmark that is Fort Sill. So my dad worked for Riverside Indian School when I was younger, and then he went to work at Fort Sill later. So we spent a lot of time on the base. It's an artillery base. And back then there was honestly a lot more freedom for us kids to roam around, but it's a lot tighter on security now. And we'd visit Geronimo's grave and the jail cell where he was housed for a short period of time. In fact, there are some bars on the windows of one of the cell doors, and the bars have been bent. So we used to always say, well, the Geronimo bent the bars because he was so strong and tough. I don't know if we were the only dumb kids saying that stuff or if it was just us, but anyway. But it was a myth, of course, but was fun to think of it that way. So side note, although that jail is called the Geronimo Guardhouse, built in 1873, Geronimo was only in the jail for a short period of time, but occasionally was thrown in jail for drunkenness. He lived in his own home and had animals and grew crops and so on. On the base, we'd also visit the graves of other famous natives such as Quanah Parker and countless Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache who were prisoners of war there at Fort Sill. And there was the Fort Sill Indian School established in 1871. Even being as young as a teenager, I really didn't take it for granted the important and terribly sad story that's found there at Fort Sill, but nonetheless, it's a story worth knowing. So let's unwrap what the history of Fort Sill is all about and how it ties to the story of Geronimo. Fort Sill is located just north of Lawton, Oklahoma, west of I-44. It started as a frontier cavalry post and played a role in the American Indian conflict. You'll find Fort Sill along with what used to be inhabited by the Wichita in the 1850s along Medicine Creek. Now, Medicine Creek has its own history. For instance, in season 1, episode 5, parts 1 and 2, my Kiowa guest, Monroe Pt2, talks about his great-grandfather Hunting Horse, who was also a prisoner of war, and he preferred to camp by Medicine Creek rather than stay in the barracks. A plaque in one of the bluffs states that young braves fasted in lonely vigils, seeking visions of the supernatural, and warriors presented their shields to the rising sun for power. It was a place where people were brought to be healed, but it was also a place where a 310-foot cliff was a site for Native American suicides. I personally like to think of it more so as that place of healing, but of course we have to remember the good and the bad with our history. So side note, anyone who knows the Wichita Mountains out there in the Wildlife Refuge knows Mount Scott. I remember climbing up Mount Scott and down Mount Scott, but for some reason we always seem to do that in the hottest parts of the summer, like Michael and I are in right now. So anyway, this mountain was named after General Winfield Scott, who had fought in the war with Mexico. And all those years of my climbing that mountain, I never knew that. So back to Fort Sill. It was named after Brigadier General Joshua Sill by his West Point classmate, General Sheridan. And another fact, the first Indian agent was the grandson of Daniel Boone. So some interesting little tidbits for you listeners out there. So Michael, let's talk about how Fort Sill was part of Geronimo's story, as well as many other American Indian stories. with the white man encroaching on their territories, which meant no place to graze livestock, the thinning out of their buffalo herds, and so on. Several tribes went full on raiding in an attempt to object to the goings on of the time. So over time, soldiers fought against the tribes and began bringing them one by one into Fort Sill as prisoners of war. Some were captured, some surrendered. And so again, you have Geronimo's own surrender and what happened next once Geronimo and his tribe lived at Fort Sill. That's what I've been wanting to know. What happened next there?
The Choctaw Nation has always provided a foundation upon which a future can be built. From our home in southeast Oklahoma to a bingo hall that grew to be one of the largest casinos in the world. Today's summer school programs lay the groundwork for a love of learning. Small business programs support local economies. And with over 10,000 jobs created, Choctaw offers financial stability to tribal members and our neighbors. Together we build success, because together we're more.
Thanks for listening to Native ChocTalk. Be sure to join our community on